Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Valentine Gaillot. Welcome to this seminar organized by the VP6. I have Professor Zoltan Molnar here and Dr. Matt Lennon, and they are going to guide you towards self-experimentation. So I will let them start. Thank you a lot for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Valentine. So just as an introduction, my name is Matt Lennon, and I'm a doctor originally from Australia, and I'm a graduate student here at Oxford with Professor Zoltan Molnar. And I'll let Zoltan introduce himself.
I'm Zoltan Molnar. I'm a professor of developmental neuroscience here in Oxford, looking at brain development. And I'm also in charge of work package 6 for the neurotech. And Matt was in the classroom when I was giving an MSc neuroscience lecture, and he was really interested in self-experimentation. So this has brought us together.
So what I'll just start by showing my screen. Entire screen share. So I think we can all see that, and we're currently looking into the abyss. We'll fix it up. Zoltan, can you see?
Yes, it's
work? Yeah. Perfect. Okay. So I suppose I want to start with a quote, and that is a quote from an Oxford biologist by the name of JBS Haldane. He said, "To do the sort of things that a dog does that one does to the average medical student requires a license signed in triplicate by 2 archbishops, as far as I can remember. A human colleague and I therefore began experiments on one another." And this is in one of his very famous essays on being one's own rabbit. This is a picture of JBS Haldane, and I mean, if you look at that mustache, it is a fantastic mustache. And you can tell there's something a little mad about him that, you know, would give you the sense that he wouldn't really care much what an ethics panel would have to say, and that's that sense of being blocked by arbitrary restrictions, I think, is what we'll explore in this talk, is what drives a lot of these self-experimenters to go out on a limb. And JBS Haldane himself, to better understand nitrogen narcosis and the effect of that on brains of deep sea divers, he incarcerated himself in decompression tanks for extended periods. And he discovered some amazing things about gaseous toxicities, but he had lifelong seizures as a result, and oxygen poisoning, and multiple ruptured eardrums. And as you can imagine, he lived life on the edge, and he's dead now. And as an interesting side note, JBS Haldane died of cancer, and his last words were a poem that he wrote about his own cancer that went something along the lines of, "I wish I had the voice of Homer to sing of rectal carcinoma," which I thought was just a truly epic way to die. A real take that to cancer. So this session, I thought we try to keep it interactive. And so what I want to do is ask you, the audience, what you think about a couple of questions. So if I could get everyone who's in the talk to sign into this. So if you go to this website, Socrative, and I've posted the details in the chat. And once you get to Socrative, if you click login and then student login, and you type in this code, Lennon 366, you should be able to get in. I don't know how many people we have in. Valentine, how many people do we have in that I should expect in this?
You should expect around 50.
Okay, great. So this is the website. If you just go through to there, and then you go login, student login, and then type in this code, then you should be able to easily log in and have a think about the answers. We'll just give everyone a moment to hop in and give their thoughts. It won't record your name or email or anything. And just while people are answering, so what we'll discuss in this talk is we'll have a couple of questions now, and we'll discuss what that sort of means and what people's thoughts are on the ethics of self-experimentation in neuroscience. And then we'll talk about some salient examples of what have been successful and unsuccessful examples of self-experimentation in neuroscience. And then we'll discuss at the end where some future directions might be for this study, and what sort of limitations people might think that we should put on it. And we'll have a few more questions for you, the audience, to give us your thoughts on. So we're still waiting on a few people. We might just show results. So looking at these results, you can see 86% of people have said yes, they do think voluntary euthanasia should be legal. 14% have said no. And this is very interesting. Nobody's not sure. That's quite an unusual result for any survey. So this is the next question. Just asking, in your opinion, should voluntary human experimentation that involves considerable risk of death or serious harm be legal? So I'll give you guys a second to think about that. And this is keeping in mind not self-experimentation, but just people showing up for, a brain transplantation experiment and seeing if that, not being the experimenter themselves. So we're waiting for some more people we'll show what people think. So in this, 42% of people, or 40% of people have said yes, and 30% have said no, and 30% have said not sure. So that's, and I think people are increasingly unsure, which is interesting given that 86% of people said that you can voluntarily choose to end your life, but for the sake of ending your life, but for the sake of experimentation, there's only 36% of people, and actually the majority of people say no, or they're not sure as to whether or not you should have the degree of autonomy to risk your life or risk your serious risk of harm to yourself, for some potential gain of scientific knowledge. Now, this next question is related, and it's, in your opinion, should voluntary human self-experimentation that involves considerable risk of death or serious harm be legal? People are really thinking about this one. I think this is, it sort of makes you wonder about what the interaction between autonomy and informed consent is. And so if we show, so 48% of people, so nearly half of everyone has said, yes, you should be able to experiment on yourself, even if there is serious risk of death or harm. But 30% of people said no. So it's still a much lower percentage of people who've said that you should have the autonomy to take your own life. And so the question of where your bodily autonomy ends, so whether or not you have unlimited bodily autonomy, so you can do whatever you want to yourself, or if there are restrictions on what exactly you can do to yourself, is, I think, what we're really going to be going into in this presentation. So we'll leave that there for the moment, and we'll come back to this presentation. So the first example of a self-experimenter is Isaac Newton, and that was back in 1672. He had a famous scientific tract called Optics. What I want you to do now is I just want you to press on your eye just at the bottom there with your finger. And what you'll notice if you keep pressing there, that there's a disturbance, what Isaac Newton calls a phosphene in your vision, and it occurs in the top half of your vision, even though you're pressing on the bottom. And this is exactly what Isaac Newton did, except with a large needle. And he poked himself around the eye for hours on end, and eventually he mapped out where the phosphenes corresponded in his vision to the point that he was pressing. And using that, he developed the camera design principle of the eye, or his theory of the camera design principle. And that is that light goes in one direction and hits the opposite side. So there's sort of a point at which the image is flipped around or transferred. And that's really a foundational principle of optic neuroscience that he developed through this very simple self-experimentation. That's a sort of benign but exciting example of how it can help. So Professor Molnar is now just going to talk about Angelo Ruffini.
So for me, Angelo Ruffini is my hero because he did some amazing self-experimentations and combined physiology with anatomy. So Angelo Ruffini was trained as a medic in Bologna, and he was born in 1864 and died in 1929. And then he became chair of anatomy at Siena. He had some amazing contribution to amphibian gastrulation, neuromuscular junction, and also the fine description of the muscle spindle. So he used gold chloride to stain these structures. And on the next slide, if you could advance, Matt, he made all these very important discoveries. And all medical students have to learn the Ruffini's corpuscles, which are basically subcutaneous connective tissue sensory endings. And also, if you look at the muscle spindles, he described the nerve innervations. And on the next slide, I just want to show you a box which we have here in Oxford. And this is the box of Sir Charles Sherrington. And in this box, we have 10 or 11 slides from Ruffini. So if we open it up and we move into the tray, you can see that these slides have slightly different nail varnish to seal the cover slip. In Italy, Ruffini was using slightly different techniques. And these are the sections which Ruffini sent to Sherrington. And we can have a look at these sections in more detail. As you can see, Sherrington even dedicated these slides to Sherrington. And if we try to read it, then you can see the organi nervosi sul connectiva de pulpa degli dita uomo. So this slide on the left is actually a section from Ruffini's finger where he found a sensory ending. And after he found this ending, he cut out this piece of tissue and then used this gold chloride staining and had a look at the endings. And on the next slide, we can see some of these preparations which he prepared. So we know that this is exactly what happened because we have the letters which Professor Giuseppe Morizzi drew Sir John Eccles, who was Sherrington's student originally. And they looked for these letters, and now we are looking at an original letter of correspondence between Sherrington and Ruffini. And this is where Sherrington is describing some of these nerve endings, and he is really interested in Ruffini's work. He is trying to help Ruffini to publish this in the Proceeding of Royal Society, but the paper was rejected. Then Foster, Sherrington's mentor, communicated it in the Journal of Physiology, and also later Ruffini published it in Italian. But basically, this is a friendship between two scientists. And on the next slide, I hope we can see more of this letter. And also, this is the original preparation and the textbook figure we can see. So this is the Ruffini end organ, which you have in your fingertips. And we are looking at a piece of Ruffini's finger, which he cut out. And it would have been very difficult to discover these organs and the particular stimuli associated with it without actually removing that piece and then staining it and putting into the microscope. So the next slide. So this is the publication which was eventually was published in Italian by Ruffini, describing these organelles. We torture medical students with, they have to learn all these, whether they are slowly adapting or rapidly adapting and receptors. And on the next slide, this is the proof that actually this is really Ruffini's finger, because Sherrington told this to Eccles when he was a student. So in fact, one occasion he showed me a slide of a cutaneous corpuscle, which he told me was actually cut by Ruffini out of his own skin. The technique was to find a cutaneous spot of special sensitivity and then to excise the piece of histological examination. So this is an amazing story of self-experimentation and also friendship and collaboration between two giants of neuroscience.
These are just some more pictures. So the next case that we'll look into is something similar, and it's a neurologist by the name of Dr. Henry Head, who lived from 1861 to 1940. And in 1903, he'd had this problem for some years where he was examining patients who, in traumatic accidents, had transected nerves, and he found it very difficult to get precise and reproducible results when he did sensory examinations on them. And because of this inconsistency, he said to himself, well, I'll try it on myself. And so he had his friend, who's a neurosurgeon, Dr. James Sharon, in 1903, cut a part of his radial nerve. And what you see in the picture here is day one after he's had this part of the radial nerve cut, the area where he's lost his fine discriminative touch. And what he found some really interesting things. The first was that while he lost his fine sensation, which he called epicritic, he retained his pressure sensation, which he called protopathic, and that was something that wasn't really fully understood prior. What he also demonstrated was that the sensation changed slightly. There was also a disassociation between pain and fine touch sensation, as well as pressure sensation, indicating there are a few different pathways there. But really excitingly, during the surgery, they transected the part of the radial nerve, but then they sewed it back together with these silk sutures, and they demonstrated that you can regrow nerves. And it was one of the first demonstrations of that concept. So it was a really an incredible bunch of experiments that really developed the field of sensory neuroscience in a fantastic way. And this is him again with a great mustache. And the next case we'll look at is 1943, a fellow by the name of Albert Hoffman. Now, he was a chemist, and he was synthesizing a number of different compounds, and he synthesized LSD back in 1937. But it wasn't until 1942, or 1943 rather, he had it on his lab desk, and he accidentally had a very small hole in his glove, and he incidentally took it up through the hole in his glove onto his skin, and had a small trip. He then, a couple of days later, after enjoying the trip, tried a 250 milligram dose of LSD, which is an absolutely whopping dose, and then he hopped on his bicycle and rode home, and had this insane phantasmagorical psychedelic ride home. And that's actually the origin of Bicycle Day, which is this big festival that people who love psychedelics have every year. It's the whopping dose of LSD. In a similar vein, John Lilly, he was sort of following in his footsteps, and he self-experimented a whole lot with isolation tanks, and isolation tanks are still popular today, and it's essentially a tank of warm water where you float and it's all dark, and it's supposed to simulate having no sound, no vision, no feeling, just a pure sensory isolation where you're alone with your thoughts. And he hypothesized that that might help with anxiety and depression, and he found in some small studies that it might. He then further hypothesized that taking LSD while in these tanks might help with anxiety and depression, and the results were sort of inconclusive. He further hypothesized that taking LSD while in a sensory isolation tank with a dolphin might help with these kinds of mental illnesses. And as you can see, he's sort of got further and further off the road of hard science. And this is, in my mind, he sort of highlights the danger of self-experimentation, in that he was trying all these things, and there wasn't real strong oversight, and so there were cases that were potentially quite dangerous. And a really good example that I haven't mentioned in the slides here of that danger is Oliver Sacks, who a lot of you might know. He's a very famous neurologist, who's most famous for his book, The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat. And he was actually a big advocate of self-experimentation as well. So he experimented with a number of drugs as a young doctor, including morphine, and I think he used some psychedelics as well. But one time after using morphine, he hallucinated for 12 hours that on his dressing gown there was a microscopically detailed battle scene, and he later realized that scene was 1415 aerial view of the Battle of Agincourt. Precisely how he knew what that battle looked like, and whether or not, without actually being there in 1415, is sort of escapes me. But after that, he stopped self-experimentation because he realized that he potentially could have died with that dose of morphine. But he argued, similar to John Lilly, that these self-experimentations might sensitize me to the experiences of a sort my patient could have, while simultaneously providing him with direct knowledge of mechanisms of the physical components of the brain that construct consciousness. And I think up to now we've seen that most of these researchers have been involved in sensory neuroscience. And there's something, these self-experimenters often say that there's some subjective phenomenological aspect of this research that can never be adequately communicated or understood by researchers. And so they just end up trying it themselves. And this is a picture of John Lilly with the dolphin. What's also interesting is that these self-experimenters who try these drugs are often castigated as being a little bit wild and off the charts. And those criticisms may be accurate, but these self-experiments can generate research avenues through generations and over time that people find it difficult to predict. And psychedelic research, particularly psilocybin, is becoming an increasingly well-developed field as people look into things like microdosing and large dose single experiences and the effect that has on mental illness and as a potential therapeutic strategy. This next story, we sort of jump to prosthetics. So Kevin Warwick is an amazing fellow. In 1998, he was the first person in the world to have a silicon microchip inserted under his skin, and he used it to, open doors and have a digital readout basically of himself. And people are now doing this more and more commonly, where they'll look at their bank cards and they'll put it under their skin so that they can just use their hand and pay for things, which is kind of funny but a little bit weird. But after he had this microchip put in, he wanted to go further, and so he had a 100 microelectrode chip inserted onto his median nerve in his arm, and provided a digital readout. And you can see this is the construct he had. He looks like Darth Vader or some kind of freaky science fiction man. But they used the digital readout from the median nerve to control a mechanical hand. And he had this thing in, I imagine it would have been quite painful, for about 3 months. And this was with the support of his university. And not only could he control this hand when it was nearby, but he went to New York while his mechanical hand was back in his university in the UK, and he sent signals over the Atlantic, and he managed to control it at a great distance. So and this technology hasn't precisely been translated into prosthetics or into paraplegics. They've tended to use other methods, but it was a very interesting first demonstration of how you might use nerve readouts for prosthetics, and it was a really, truly exciting development. So the next story is a story of a guy called Philip Kennedy that Prof. Molnar might talk about for a bit.
Right. So this is another very interesting story, Philip Kennedy. As you know, one of the ultimate challenges is to understand what kind of signals do we generate to move our body or to generate speech. And for this, it would be a great idea to have more close contact to the brain and record directly from the brain rather than using other indirect methods, which doesn't have the same spatial or temporal resolution. So Philip Kennedy is a pioneer, and he developed electrode systems, conical electrodes for implantation, which integrate into the brain extremely well. And on the next slide, we can also show that when such implantation could be actually extremely useful. So for instance, if you have this brain-computer interface could be extremely useful when you have a locked-in patient, like in Brown University, they implanted this device, somebody who had a stroke for 15 years before, and now with the signals, they could generate movement, could lift a bottle and drink and put it back to the table, which was a huge breakthrough for a tetraplegic patient. And on the next slide, so Philip Kennedy is a pioneer in this field, and he had some major contributions. For instance, the case of Johnny Ray, again a tetraplegic patient who, after such implantation, could actually type his own name and type the names of all the collaborators, and Philip Kennedy was involved in this. However, his funding was drying up, and he was also very interested in taking it a bit further. And on the next slide, if you look at him, you see that he's a charismatic, very articulate, excellent scientist until you hear the story I'm just about to tell you. In the next slide, he decided actually to implant this brain-machine communication interface to himself. And so he fixed the tip of some of these Teflon-coated gold wires inside hollow glass, and then he put some sciatic nerve for animal implants and some chemical cocktails, BDNF and growth factors for himself, and then implanted it to himself. Of course, he didn't get ethical permits to do it in the US. So on the next slide, you see that he had to travel to Belize. And here he paid $30,000 to two neurosurgeons, Poten and Cervantes, who implanted this his own glass and gold wire electrodes into his left hemisphere, somewhere around the Broca's area. So they implanted it, and it was in the right region. The operation went well, but however, a few days later, he had complications of the surgery. There was edema. He had seizures. He couldn't speak. The only words he could utter was "sorry, sorry," and so he was in a horrible state. Can you imagine the family and relatives and partner, when they hear about this? So he had to be put on anti-seizure medication, and however, he started recording. He flew back to the US and he was recording from himself. And then he decided that he wanted to implant a power coil and the radio transceiver. It would be the second operation. So he flew back to Belize again. and they implanted this under the skin, but it was quite a bulky implantation, and the skin never really healed. But he still flew back to the US, and he was recording for 88 days. And after this, he didn't have to pay because they removed it in the US after he had complications. So this is another question: who should pay for all this when things go wrong in these self-experimentations? Now, of course, if you think about it, yes, it's probably the best way to get very important data, how we generate speech. But with the exception of a poster which he presented in the Society for Neuroscience, we haven't seen a detailed publication of this yet.
Yeah. The story of this next fellow, 2015, is this guy called Brian Hanley. And he self-experimented with a neuroendocrine hormone. So what he noticed that as people age, you had a decrease in growth hormone releasing hormone, as well as growth hormone and testosterone, a number of other hormones. So he had this idea that he would inject plasmids via electroporation into the muscle fibers in his leg. And he had 2 sessions where he did this. It was 2015, 2016. And he based this idea off veterinary medicine, where they've been shown that they've shown that when you inject growth hormone releasing hormone plasmids to cows, it can be as effective as antibiotics in preventing bovine infections, and it's assisted dogs with chemotherapy. And so he decided to try it himself. The first time he did it without institutional support, but he did it with a couple of friends helped him and injected the plasmids in. He didn't think that he'd need anesthetic the first time, and just so everyone knows what electroporation is, you run a pretty high volume electric current, which then makes the cells that you're trying to insert the genes into porous, and then you basically pressure push the genes in. And so he was effectively electrocuted while awake for 10 minutes while this thing was going in, and he said it was excruciatingly painful. During the second attempt, he did have anesthetic, and that helped. He said so. He wanted to get approval for this, and he asked the FDA, and they said he would need to get approval as a investigational new drug for human testing. But he said he wouldn't worry about that. He also argued that he felt justified. He's written a paper trying to justify self-experimentation. And he argued that there's a specific exemption that we'll talk about in a couple of codes that allowed him to do this kind of experimentation. Interestingly, similar to Philip Kennedy, he did his studies in 2016, and the only place that he's published his results that we've been able to find is Reddit. And on Reddit, he published that his testosterone increased by 20%, leukocytes by 16%, HDL by 20%, and his LDL cholesterol decreased by 20%. So, and he also thinks that his healing rate was faster. So some really exciting results. And it would be a truly revolutionary therapy if we could, instead of giving antibiotics, give growth hormone or extend people's longevity by giving this gene therapy, giving this neuroendocrine hormone. But without the institutional supports, the regulatory oversight, the necessity to report and pre-specify the methods, there doesn't seem to be that organizational structure around them that allows them to report and submit their findings to journals. So they're some of the key stories, and now we're sort of asking about the future. There are lots of stories out there of self-experimentation in other fields. More interestingly, recently, Elon Musk has been spruiking his Neuralink, and people have been having chips inserted into their brain, and there's been some optogenetic stimulation in there. I'm not exactly sure of the details, but there's certainly been chips inserted in the brain, and this been a greater push to develop these brain-computer interfaces. There's also been a whole generation of gene hackers. So there've been a number of people, without success yet, who've been injecting themselves with CRISPR-Cas9 constructs with the hope of permanently altering their DNA and creating some kind of transhumans. So there are some really interesting and probably questionable movements in this area, which brings us back to what kind of frameworks should we have around self-experimentation? Now, the Nuremberg Code, which is the basis of modern research ethics, actually provides a specific exemption for self-experiments and really experimental protocols that involve the experimental physicians as subjects. So in Article 5, they say, no experiment should be conducted if there is an a priori reason to believe that death or disabling injury will occur, except perhaps in experiments where the experimental physicians also serve as subjects. And it's been said that the Nuremberg trials decided to include this because in the US, there are a couple of famous experiments at Walter Reed where a number of research participants died after ingesting yellow fever. But the researchers also died because they were part of the experiment, and they thought that the German defense, or the Nazi doctor defense, would be that in fact other countries perform experimentation that risks and ends in the death of their experimental subjects. But there is this sort of ethical and regulatory black box around self-experimentation, and the institutions don't really they're not exactly excited to be a part of it because it's risky, and the individuals don't want to be regulated, and that's part of the reason they go and self-experiment in the first place. But it seems that there are some future directions in institutional recognition, support, and regulation that may actually improve the quality and output of self-experimentation while allowing these institutions to harness the greater ability for self-experimenters to go a little further than you otherwise would be able to in experimenters on experimental subjects. So what I want to do now is ask a few more questions, because I'd love to get your thoughts and opinions. And so if you could all go back to Socrates, we'll go through a couple more questions, and we're sort of picking up where we left off at the start, asking everyone what they think, what, if any, are the limits on bodily autonomy. And just to remind people, if you want to join, the instructions are in the chat, but if you just go to this website, you should be able to see how to hop on and log on. And so the first answer is no limits, your body is your own. The second answer is individuals should be prevented from risking life or limb. And the third is individuals should be prevented and or hindered from causing any harm to themselves whatsoever. So we'll just have a look at what people are thinking. So 45% of people have said no limits, your body is your own, which is also interesting because when we asked if there should be any limits on allowing individuals to participate voluntarily in experiments that might risk their life or limb, only 32% of people said they'd be okay with that. So I think I think these are questions that we're asking in society all the time about other issues, not just this issue, but it is tricky and not really one that we apply equally across the board, particularly when it comes to different mental states. So when people in psychiatry, when people are sad or depressed, they might feel suicidal. The state and the healthcare system often prevents them from taking their own life, and rightly so. But that certainly seems to be a limit on bodily autonomy. So I'll just go to the next question, but we're getting some very interesting thoughts and results. So can or should self-experimenters be stopped in acts of potentially fruitful self-harm? So this is asking, they've got, they're going like Philip Kennedy to insert a large electrode into their own head, and that is life-threatening, as he experienced. And should he, if he was in the US, should the government have stopped him? Or in Belize, should the government have regulated that, or should the institution or hospital or and the potential answers are yes in all cases, yes, but only if it is serious self-harm, and the third answer is no, they should be able to do what they want. So this is sort of reasonably consistent with the results that we had last question. About 47-48% of people are saying that these people should be able to do whatever they want, and about 20% of people said no, that they shouldn't be able to harm themselves. And I think if you think about this from a utilitarian point of view, a lot of those experiments, like the Isaac Newton experiment or the Henry Head experiment, or even Albert Hoffman experimenting with drugs, there was a small risk to themselves. It was a reasonably small amount of harm to themselves, but a very significant gain to the general population. So the next question is, if self-experimenters risk or actualize serious harm or death upon themselves while simultaneously uncovering a scientific revolution, should journals publish it? So say a scientist dies, say you discover how, I don't know, what's something truly amazing. You discover exactly how speech is developed and the neural signature of speech, and you can provide perfect translations based on your experimentation, but you die in the process. Should journals publish that, or would that encourage more risk-taking behavior from experimenters seeking glory in dangerous ways? Okay, and almost everyone has said yes, as long as it's scientifically valid. We'll wait for a couple more people to... I like that quite a few people have said yes, but only if it's big. Okay. So the next question is a tricky one. So it's, should institutions be held liable for self-inflicted research injuries performed in institutional facilities? And this is interesting and relevant because there's been a few corporate manslaughter laws in Canada, the UK, and Australia that have been brought in that essentially, for people in workplaces, when they sustain injuries or they die, it holds the workplaces liable for most or any injuries sustained at work. And there's some legal thought that if self-experimentation did result in death or serious injury, then the institutions at which it happened would be liable under these new corporate manslaughter laws. In saying that, though, it's never been tested in any case, so it remains to be seen exactly how that would go. Yeah, and so the majority of people are saying yes, but only if they've approved it. But interestingly, some people still argue that it should be in any case. And so I think the final question is, should self-experimentation be regulated? And I think this gets to the core of, should people who self-experiment just be able to do anything? Or is their bodily autonomy unlimited? And should we have any restriction on them whatsoever? Or do we have a collective responsibility for one another? And is there a limit to bodily autonomy? And therefore, should it be regulated? Okay, and again, we're getting the majority of people saying yes, they think it should be regulated. And only a very small minority saying that it shouldn't. So that brings us to the end of the questions. What we want to do now is really jump to you. And Valentin, you might help us with this, but if anyone has any thoughts or wanted to add to the discussion or had any opinions or had any questions, we'd love for you to hop up on stage and ask and yeah, voice your opinion on really anything that's been said here.
Yes, we actually have two questions. So I'm going to invite Elvire and Miklos on stage. If you do not wish to appear on stage, please feel free to refuse the invitation.
Hi, is it working? Is it
Yeah.
Okay, great. Hi, great seminar so far. I really enjoyed it. I just had a question with regards to the bodily autonomy that I was wondering if you could comment on. So if you're in the case of complete 100% bodily autonomy, do you think that if it could have an impact on others, for example, with vaccination versus bodily autonomy, or if you want to go to the self-experimentation, if you experiment with virus or bacteria, do you think that this adds another problem, or what are your thoughts on this? Has there anything been done of this sort in history? Do you think this could be a problem? Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, very topical and very relevant, particularly given that people think that COVID may have leaked out of Wuhan lab. I think that, I think that gets to the heart of it, that even if you think that what you're doing, like Philip Kennedy was doing, just affects you, no one exists in isolation except for maybe a nomad in Antarctica, and you dying or getting sick or needing healthcare, that affects everyone, and which then brings other people into the decision-making process. And so I think it makes sense that you don't have complete bodily autonomy, because you also, if you had the right to yourself completely, you would also require the responsibility for every single one of your actions and its ramifications. And I don't think anyone has that responsibility. I think it's shared amongst the community.
I agree with that.
Yeah.
It's when somebody's climbing Mount Everest or they cross the Atlantic on their own and then they have to be rescued. It is affecting others in a way. Yeah.
Thank you.
May I ask another question?
Yeah.
Okay, so My feeling is that you introduced various very interesting cases, individual cases, but what I think about it is we should precisely define what self-experimentation means. I mean, if you do it yourself, not involving, for example, other doctors, you cut your thumb. That's okay in my view. If you are sure that you will not infect other people, for example, that's okay. So I mean, this is somehow a question of correct definition of self-experimentation. If you do it yourself without involving others and without endangering others, then it could be legal and valid. And in all the other cases, it is not, because it can cause serious problems, what you have mentioned before. I don't know, what do you think about the precise definition of self-experimentation?
Oh, Zoltan, do you have...
Oh, go ahead.
It's a good question. I think you raise a really good point in that there are very few experiments, particularly today, that you could truly do by yourself. It involves people producing the materials, and you have to source things from other places. And if you get sick, then somebody needs to look after you. But I think the definition that a lot of people would subscribe to for self-experimentation is that you are the person who has come up with the experimental protocol, and therefore you have a greater capacity to consent because you understand the protocol and you understand the risks in a way that an experimental subject couldn't really, because they're not a lifetime scientist who has developed this protocol and who has thought up the processes and the pros and cons. They're sort of a layperson who, with an hour introduction as to what the risks and benefits might be, can't really fully understand exactly what they're getting themselves into. So I think having the experimenter who's come up with a protocol submit to the protocol themselves is how I might define self-experimentation.
But it's very difficult to predict what is without any harm or without other consequences. So yeah, fine. If I want to cut my thumb off, that's okay. But then maybe I can have all sorts of complications, and then it will influence my family, my surrounding, the doctors in the John Radcliffe Hospital who will have to save me. So it will have all sorts of ramifications. So it's difficult to predict where to draw the line. We were just talking with Matt before the talk that in a way we all do self-experimentations. If you just look at your mobile phone and the kind of record you have on yourself is just incredible. So you have Strava, you have MyZone, you have Sleep, or whatever programs you have on your phone. All this is actually constantly monitoring yourself, and you can experiment, sleep cycle, these kind of things. So and these are very interesting questions. How do you use this data? Who should use it? What is self-monitoring, self-experimentation? Yeah, we will have more sessions on this, hopefully. We are getting some speakers for Work Package 6, where we can talk exactly about these kind of questions later. What's your view? What's your view on this?
That's a very good point. That maybe the borderline should be the fact that there is a wide agreement of, I don't know, reviewers or other views should agree that it is absolutely sure that others will be not involved or not endangered. That could be a first point. If any one of the reviewers has troubles about it, then it should be stopped, because it's not a clear self-experimentation anymore. So that could be a level 0, I would say.
Yeah, interesting idea. It was the question of regulation may also the moot one anyway, because the whole idea is that even if you try to stop them, they will do so. But I think what became clear as we did more reading into more of these stories, that the people who go out by themselves without institutional support, without sort of a community around them, don't really tend to publish, and that means that the risks that they take haven't really been justified by a furtherance of scientific knowledge. So I think that's a big
but
problem.
in reality, when you want to do something, you will apply for a foundation for some support.
Yeah.
That would be kind of ethical review, independent. I mean, ethical review. If you apply for support, that's the first point to say that you must be absolutely sure that others will be not involved in any sense.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much.
And I think that there's one question in the chat from Tony. By your logic of community, why is it not the other's problem trying to copy me? So I think correct me if I'm wrong, Tony, but I think what you're getting at is that if you have copycat people who would get themselves into trouble from doing self-experimentation, is that not your fault? That's their fault, because they're trying to copy you. And I think that that makes sense, and that is the whole idea, that people have their own individual freedom and rights, and they will. There's nothing really new under the sun anyway, because when you self-experiment, you're copying someone. You're somebody has done this before. It might not be the exact experiment, but that then causes you to copy. Is that a correct interpretation?
Can you hear me? First
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, sorry. I think I should phrase my question a little bit more clearly, right? So, and it covers a broader spectrum than what I wrote in the chat, which is very little. So what you said originally was that we don't exist in a vacuum, so certain times self-experiment could cause complication to others, right? And by that logic, then we don't have complete self-autonomy, right? And what I wanted to ask and to kind of talk about is that there is a difference between something is bad versus something should not be done, right? Say things like, let's say generally, lying is bad, but it's not illegal, right? So not everything.
It is in some cases. I mean,
it isn't. Yeah, but like it is not
fraud.
But it's not in every single case, right? Right. Say if you ask me, hey Tony, how's your day? Right, I'm not gonna tell you every single thing that happened to me, good or bad, right? A lot of time I just brush over a lot of things, and that's sometimes you might actually want to know, and the fact that I'm not telling you is not a good thing, but it's not illegal, right? And then, so in that way, I kind of want that brings up the question, right? Just simply because something is bad, does it necessarily make it illegal? So for things like, if I want to cut off my thumb, that might affect my family, affect my kids. I might not make as much money, and then the mortgage that me and my wife are paying together now is suffering, right? Like those are the things that could possibly happen. Right? Like, and obviously they're not good things, but does that make it right for a authority to stop me from doing it? Like if I have a hard time convincing myself that the answer is yes.
What do you think, Zoltan?
I was looking up another case. Sorry.
Yeah. I think just to respond to that briefly, if the whole concept of liberalism is that we exist as individuals, and we have a right to freedom and private property and freedom of expression, etc. This is the whole concept that underlies autonomy and free will. I think where you have rights, you have reciprocal responsibilities, and somebody has to fulfill those responsibilities. Often it's you, and a lot of the time it's the government. The role of the government in this concept of liberalism is to support your right to freedom of expression and freedom of movement and private property. And now there are these whole charters of rights that governments are supposed to support people's rights to education and health, but with the right to do things freely comes reciprocal responsibilities to act responsibly. And when you act irresponsibly, and then obviously governments will come down on you. And there's this mode of thought that people will argue that if you're not affecting anyone else, you can do whatever you want. But particularly the example you bring where you chop off your own thumb, that definitely will affect other people. They'll incur healthcare costs. If as another example, you decide to inject a lot of heroin and you become an addict, that's going to cost the government a lot. That's going to cost your family personally a lot. There's going to be a lot of healthcare costs. And so by that logic, the government says you're not allowed to, it's illegal to inject heroin. And so I think an argument could be similarly made that you would cause an unreasonable burden on healthcare and other people if you chopped off your thumb.
A question here. Say in the case of injecting heroin, are my family bound to be associated with it?
Well, not necessarily, but insofar as they are supported by you, they're affected by it, and somebody is bound to look after you, be it your family or the government or.
Why? Like, I mean, who is bound to look after me? Who is legally bound to look after me? Right? No one's, as far as I know, no one is legally bound to look after me.
The state does have a duty of care to you.
Yeah, and as much as it has a duty of care to every citizen, right? And regardless of whether I am a self-experimenter or not. So the fact that I'm a self-experimenter is not relevant to discussion as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, sure.
Right. I mean, I'm bringing up, like, I'm thinking out loud right now. Not trying to say that you're wrong, but rather I'm trying to get my idea picked on, hey, this is where you kind of went, a little bit off the road. So in a way that, like, if you think of it like that, right? No individual is really legally bound to look after me. The state is legally bound to look after me to the same extent that they look after every single citizen. Whether I'm self-experimenting or not is completely irrelevant to this discussion. So in that case, why would that argument be a reason against self-experiment?
I'm not sure I fully understand the question, but I think in part, in answer to something you said previously, no individual is legally bound to look after you, but I think there's normative and relational ethics that are generally understood by the population, where your people exists not in isolation but in familial networks and in friendship networks, and people do have an ethical duty to help out their fellow human beings, and it's not just a purely government institution. I think that's why we have responsibilities for those around us, and so your family, your wife, your kids, your mum, whoever you might have around you does have, I would argue, an ethical responsibility, if not a legal one, to help you out.
So what I'm hearing is that the duty to look after me of some other individual is rather a soft line, right?
Yeah.
So boundary of where I should self-experiment or not should also be just as soft.
Yeah, I mean, yeah.
Right. And then so it is up to me to make the responsible decision whether I should do self-experiment. Right.
Yeah.
So ultimately, so like this is what I'm trying to get at, right? Like ultimately it's up to me to make a responsible decision. But it should not be the case that another overarching authority is telling me you cannot make such decision.
Yeah.
Is there, do you see anything particularly wrong with this line of thinking?
Yeah, I mean, I think that certainly makes sense with current ethical norms as they're practiced in our society.
I see. Okay.
Tony, when Stephen Kennedy had the complications, the first phone call went to the partner who was completely against of the implantation. So the first phone call is always going to somebody close to you in family, whether you agreed or not. And of course, the partner said, I don't want to hear about it because they were against. And the case I was looking up, but I just couldn't get very far, is, of course, the famous case of Barry Marshall and Robin Warren,
Yes.
who infected themselves with Helicobacter pylori. And I just wanted to check whether they discussed it with their partners or not when they did it. Because imagine I have this idea to do that, and I have a family and kids, I just wanted to, do you know the answer to that?
No, he's an Australian guy.
Yeah,
no,
I know. He's from Perth, but I would love to know whether they discussed it with the family before they did that,
Yeah.
because it could have gone very wrong.
Yeah.
Or Hunter infected himself with gonorrhea, way before. Yeah.
Very interesting.
I mean, I'm definitely coming from a young person's perspective, right, where I don't have a lot of binding responsibilities, and definitely not in any long-term sense, right? So but I do understand from the perspective that if you do have a lot of those are factors that you want to take into consideration, right? But the bottom line I would like to draw here, it was just that the all should be up to the person themselves, right? And if you say, hey, this is your own idea, and so your research grant should not be paying for your self-experiment, like that's normal, that's perfectly fine, right? And I think the other side of it is also education is very important, right? So like if you want people to make their own decisions, you give them a lot of freedom, as you said. The freedom, with freedom comes responsibilities, right? And then you cannot have a fool who is educated enough to place all the responsibilities clearly and prioritize one over the other. And so personally, I don't think the emphasis should be on legal enforcement and invading in personal freedom in a way, but rather in improving education in such things and encourage discussions of such matters, and so that more people are informed, because I think that when everybody is more informed, that's how you kind of progress as also as a community as a whole, right? So where you have a lot of freedom, but people know good enough not to abuse that.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, which is also why I'm a fan of joining such events.
But that's exactly the point of neurotech as well, to kind of if you look at the revolution of the new technologies you can use, and how do we embrace them, and how do we cope with the ethical implications, that's a very big issue. And I think that's why it would be nice to compare regional ideas, because Europe is very big, and see how the different opinions are together. And I think that's why I'm very, very grateful for Matt, who really was pushing this whole idea forward and presenting it and doing the survey. And I think we will have lots of more events, especially in Work Package 6 in neurotech. And I already have a next speaker, Professor Kristalina Antoanides, who is going to talk about self-monitoring and also distance monitoring, and what are the ethics for that. And she's collecting together a bigger group, where we can explore industry ethics and also neuroscience together. So hopefully we will have an event. But I'm very, very grateful to Matt and also Valentin for organizing this event. And hopefully we will have more. And also for your participation and also for the discussion.
And thank you so much, Professor Molnar, for getting it all sorted. Yeah, so thank you so much, everyone, for coming. It's been really interesting. Great to have your feedback and ideas and opinions. And yeah, we look forward to seeing you at the next event.